This is a little bit small, but if you look on page 104 of your textbook, you're going to find this table, the properties of equality. You need to know these. These properties of equality are very, very important. The addition property of equality simply means that when I add something to one side of an equation, I add it to the other. The subtraction property of equality means that when I subtract something from one side of an equation, I subtract it from the other. The multiplication property of equality means I multiply both sides of the equation by the same value. The division property of equality says that I divide both sides by the same value. Be aware you can't divide by 0. When you try to divide by 0, you get something that is undefined in math. The reflexive property of equality is when something is equal to itself. We typically think of that with geometric shapes, like our lines of reflection. We will look at that later on. The symmetric property of equality is going to be used primarily when we're cleaning up our final answer. If I end up with an answer like 3 equals x, it's not that that's wrong, but we prefer to write it x equals 3. We always like the variable to come first. So we use the symmetric property of equality to put our variable on the left and the value that it's equivalent to on the right-hand side. The transitive property of equality, remember that's the one that I liken to a choo-choo train. So if A equals B, that's the engine of your train hooking up to a freight car, and B equals C, that's the freight car hooking up to the caboose, we can remove the freight car and A equals C. The engine can hook up to the caboose. I know it's kind of dorky, but some of you liked that analogy to help us out. And then the substitution property of equality is when you're plugging in a value to maybe solve some arithmetic or double check your arithmetic. But this table that you have here on page 104 is very important. You need to become comfortable with it, and unfortunately you're going to need to commit it to memory. This is not going to be provided to you for notes on the end of course exam. You're going to have to be able to remember these terms. The first 4 are usually not the problem. It's the last 4 that most students have difficulty remembering. So you may want to make flashcards. You may want me to upload this video to YouTube and let you watch it again at the end of May, beginning of June, before we take the end of course exam. But learn these properties of equality. They are very, very important. On page 106 of your textbook, you see the table that has the properties of congruence. You need to know these properties of congruence just like you need to know the properties of equality. So the reflexive property of congruence means one shape, which they're calling figure A, is congruent to another figure A. Notice how the book recommends abbreviating that, reflex prop of, and then you use the congruent sign. So the example they give you is that one segment is congruent to another segment. Or we could have one triangle congruent to another triangle. Or we could have some sort of hexagon congruent to another hexagon. But these are shapes, okay? The symmetric property of congruence is when 2 different figures or 2 different shapes are equivalent to each other. So the example that they're showing you in the book is that if angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, then angle 2 is congruent to angle 1. Maybe try to visualize a set of vertical angles. So angle 1 and angle 2 are across from each other, kind of like the capital R's in the railroad sign. Remember, that's the one that I suggested remembering for the vertical angles. And the transitive property of congruence, that's that idea of the train again. So if the engine can hook up to a freight car and the freight car can hook up to a caboose, that means that finally the engine can hook up to the caboose. So that's the segment PQ being congruent to segment RS, and segment RS is congruent to segment TU, then segment PQ is congruent to segment TU. You need to be very careful that you understand when you should use properties of equality and when you should use properties of congruence. You're not allowed to mix and match them, even though some of the definitions and examples are very similar.